Welcome to our channel, where we calmly unravel the profound stories hidden behind the facades of fame. A Corvette speeding across the American highway. On Route 66, George Maharis stood as the symbol of untethered freedom. But that image fractured in the freezing waters of Catalina Island. His physical collapse from studio exploitation was devastating, yet it was merely the opening act. His empire wasn't destroyed by illness. It was destroyed the moment Hollywood discovered his secret gay life. It is heartbreaking to see a man ruthlessly crushed by the society that once worshipped him. Please share where and when you are watching, add any untold facts below, and kindly forgive any minor errors. Now, let us step back in time. The roots of this spectacular rise and devastating fall began far from the glamorous hills of Hollywood. George Maharis was born on September 1, 1928, in Astoria, a neighborhood located in the New York City borough of Queens. His arrival coincided with the twilight of the Roaring Twenties, mere months before the catastrophic stock market crash of 1929 that would plunge the United States into the Great Depression. He was born into a large family of Greek immigrants, becoming one of 7 children in a household strictly defined by severe economic hardship. The immigrant experience in New York during the 1930s was vastly different from the sanitized historical narratives often presented in later decades. For the Maharis family, daily life was a relentless exercise in basic survival. The family navigated the harsh realities of Astoria and later relocated to Hell's Kitchen in Manhattan. During this period, Hell's Kitchen was a notoriously rough, working-class enclave dominated by tenements, slaughterhouses, and unregulated industrial labor. It was a densely populated, loud, and often violent neighborhood where immigrant families competed fiercely for limited resources and employment opportunities. The Maharis household faced severe and constant financial struggles. The resources were stretched impossibly thin across 7 children and 2 parents. This poverty was not merely a lack of luxury. It was a fundamental deprivation that stripped away the ability to record their own history. Photographic records documenting the early childhood and shared family memories of George Maharis are exceptionally rare, a luxury they simply could not afford. This lack of documentation highlights a stark reality. When a family is entirely consumed by the mechanics of acquiring their next meal and paying rent, the concept of preserving memories becomes an unattainable privilege. Growing up in this environment of constant deprivation instilled a profound, defining psychological trait within Maharis. He developed a fierce, unrelenting drive to escape his socio-economic class. The crowded tenement apartments and the grim prospects of manual labor in Hell's Kitchen represented a life sentence he actively refused to accept. He possessed an innate rebellion against the limitations imposed upon him by his circumstances. He did not view his environment as a foundation to build upon, but rather as a trap he needed to break out of by any available means. This internal rebellion manifested early in his educational trajectory. Maharis attended Flushing High School, but the standard academic curriculum offered no tangible solutions to his immediate desire for autonomy and financial independence. The traditional path of completing high school and transitioning into local factory or service work felt indistinguishable from the poverty he was trying to flee. Driven by an urgent need to alter his trajectory, he made a decisive choice to abandon his formal education. He dropped out of Flushing High School, severing his ties to the predictable working-class pipeline. Seeking radical change and a structural environment completely removed from the chaos of his upbringing, Maharis enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. He served a standard 18-month tour of duty. For a young man raised in the unpredictable, grueling conditions of Depression-era New York, the Marine Corps offered a highly regimented, unforgiving, but entirely merit-based system. The military environment provided him with strict physical discipline, a consistent paycheck, and a temporary physical removal from the neighborhoods that he felt were suffocating him. His time in the Marines solidified his internal philosophy. He recognized early on that his life was entirely his own responsibility. He internalized the belief that existence was a journey requiring constant forward momentum, and that he was obligated to force his way out of obscurity regardless of the physical or mental toll it might exact. He famously articulated this raw ambition by stating clearly that he refused to remain trapped in his origins, viewing life as a trajectory where escape was the only acceptable outcome. Following his discharge from the Marine Corps, Maharis returned to civilian life with a disciplined mindset. Facing the terrifying prospect of remaining a permanent member of the working class, he channeled his intense drive toward dramatic acting. This transition marked the beginning of his formal education in the theatrical arts, a process that would completely rebuild his professional identity. He immersed himself in the dominant and highly demanding acting philosophy of the era, method acting. He enrolled in classes at the prestigious Neighborhood Playhouse, an institution renowned for its rigorous curriculum. Here, he studied directly under Sanford Meisner, one of the most influential acting teachers in American history. The Meisner technique required actors to focus entirely on the other performer in the scene, fostering spontaneous, authentic, and deeply grounded emotional reactions, rather than relying on premeditated theatrical gestures. Maharis subsequently continued his training at the legendary Actors Studio in Manhattan, working under the guidance of Lee Strasberg. The environment at the Actors Studio was famously intense. Strasberg required performers to utilize emotional memory, digging into their own past traumas, fears, and psychological scars to bring absolute realism to their characters. For Maharis, a man carrying the heavy baggage of extreme poverty, the harsh realities of Hell's Kitchen, and the internal terror of hiding his sexual identity in a hostile society, this psychological excavation provided a massive reservoir of raw emotional material. The gritty, brooding energy he would soon project on screen was not an artificial studio creation. It was forged in the tenements of Hell's Kitchen and hardened by the Marine Corps. Entering the legendary Actors Studio, the survival instincts of his youth became the raw fuel for his method, acting under the doctrine of emotional memory. This rigorous training began to yield significant professional dividends in the late 1950s. Maharis bypassed the mainstream commercial theater scene and gravitated toward the challenging experimental world of off-Broadway. This arena was the perfect testing ground for his specific brand of method acting. In 1958, he secured a role in Jean Genet's complex play Death Watch. Genet's work was famously transgressive, dealing with themes of criminality, dominance, and social alienation. Maharis, drawing upon the harsh realities of his youth, delivered a performance that resonated with critics who were searching for performers capable of genuine theatrical danger. His definitive theatrical breakthrough occurred 2 years later in 1960. He was cast in the original production of Edward Albee's highly influential play, The Zoo Story. The narrative was a tense, psychological confrontation between two vastly different men in Central Park, a wealthy, complacent publishing executive and an isolated, aggressive transient. Maharis possessed the exact frequency of street-smart desperation required for the material. His performance was widely recognized for its visceral power and psychological depth. The critical establishment validated his talent by awarding him the highly prestigious Theatre World Award in 1960. This accolade was a formal acknowledgement that the young man who had dropped out of high school had successfully engineered a new reality for himself. He was no longer an impoverished kid from Astoria. He was a respected, award-winning dramatic actor operating at the center of the New York theater world. This critical validation caught the immediate attention of television executives in Los Angeles. The medium of television was rapidly expanding, and network producers were actively scouting the New York stage for fresh, intense talent capable of anchoring new dramatic serials. The raw, aggressive energy that had won Maharis the Theater World Award was exactly what the CBS network needed for an ambitious new project they were developing, a show that would require its lead actor to represent the restless spirit of a changing America. The transition from the gritty theatrical stages of New York to the epicenter of American television transformed George Maharis into a cultural totem. By 1960, at the age of 32, he stepped into a role that would come to define his career and ultimately precipitate his physical and professional destruction. The Columbia Broadcasting System, known universally as CBS, cast him as Buzz Murdoch in the sprawling adventure drama Route 66. The program was an immediate, massive success, catapulting Maharis from a respected off-Broadway actor to a household name and earning him a prestigious Emmy nomination in 1962. The premise of Route 66 was conceptually ambitious and physically demanding. It followed two young men, Buzz Murdoch and Todd Stiles, traveling across a changing United States in a Chevrolet Corvette, engaging with local communities and tackling the social issues of the era. The vehicle itself was not merely a convenient prop for transportation. The Corvette was a potent, highly visible symbol of the American dream, representing mobility, post-war industrial dominance, and untethered masculinity. Driving across the country, Maharis was positioned as the ultimate representation of the restless American spirit. Screen Gems, the television production subsidiary of Columbia Pictures, and executive producer Herbert B. Leonard recognized the immense commercial value of their new star. They aggressively marketed Maharis as a wild, heterosexual sex symbol. The studio machinery fed his image to fan magazines, carefully curating a persona of a brooding, available, and highly masculine wanderer designed to captivate a vast female demographic. They were selling a specific brand of traditional, rugged heterosexuality, and Maharis was their most profitable product. Beneath this heavily managed corporate facade lay a profound and dangerous paradox. The man marketed as the ultimate heterosexual idol was a closeted homosexual operating in an environment of extreme hostility. The United States in the early 1960s did not offer a safe harbor for this reality. Homosexuality was strictly criminalized across the country. Law enforcement agencies actively hunted gay men, and the medical establishment formally categorized their existence as a severe psychiatric disorder. Maharis was forced to navigate this treacherous landscape while standing at the absolute center of global public attention. The psychological burden of maintaining this flawless deception was immense, requiring a constant, exhausting state of hypervigilance to ensure his true identity remained hidden from the studio executives, the press, and the millions of viewers who idolized him. This intense psychological pressure was compounded by a production schedule that bordered on physical abuse. Route 66 was not filmed on a controlled, comfortable soundstage in Los Angeles. The production was a massive, itinerant operation that demanded the cast and crew travel continuously. Over the course of his tenure, Maharis was forced to relocate and film across 25 different states. The logistics of moving a television production across the country meant that stability was non-existent. The working hours were grueling and exploitative. Maharis routinely worked 14 to 16 hours a day, performing physically demanding scenes in unpredictable and often harsh weather conditions. The television industry of the era lacked the stringent union protections and safety protocols that exist today. Actors were viewed as assets to be maximized, and the studio extracted every possible ounce of labor to meet tight broadcast deadlines. The constant travel, sleep deprivation, and lack of adequate nutrition severely compromised his physical health. His physical breaking point occurred during a brutal location shoot off the coast of Catalina Island. The script required Maharis to perform a highly physical water rescue sequence. The filming took place in the early hours of the morning, plunging Maharis into the freezing waters of the Pacific Ocean at 4 a.m. He was forced to remain submerged in the dangerously cold water for hours to capture multiple takes. The temperature was so severe that his wardrobe, a heavy jacket, physically froze into solid ice upon his exit from the water. This extreme exposure, combined with the accumulated exhaustion of years of relentless production and the questionable sanitary conditions of the traveling crew, triggered a complete collapse of his immune system. In late 1962, the physical bill for his stardom came due. Maharis contracted a severe case of infectious viral hepatitis. Hepatitis is a devastating inflammation of the liver, an organ critical for filtering toxins, aiding digestion, and regulating the immune system. In the early 1960s, medical interventions for the virus were limited, and the primary treatment was total, prolonged bed rest. His physician, Dr. Robert J. Kosicek, conducted a thorough examination and delivered a stark, uncompromising medical ultimatum. The doctor warned that Maharis was standing on the precipice of a total biological failure. If he did not immediately cease all physical exertion and commit to a period of absolute rest, he faced the certainty of permanent, irreversible liver damage or imminent death. Confronted with his own mortality, Maharis recognized the absolute necessity of halting production. He firmly communicated his stance to the studio, declaring emphatically that even if an individual possessed $4 million in the bank, they could not purchase a replacement liver. His health had to take absolute precedence over the television schedule. However, the corporate apparatus of Screen Gems did not view his illness as a medical emergency. They viewed it as a breach of contract and an interruption of revenue. The situation deteriorated into a hostile confrontation. Many historians and industry whispers suggest executive producer Herbert B. Leonard may have discovered the truth regarding Maharis and his sexual orientation, adding a layer of personal vindictiveness to the contract dispute. Leonard, operating under the intense prejudices of the time, felt personally deceived and corporately vulnerable. He had invested vast sums of money building Maharis into a heterosexual commodity. The revelation of his homosexuality was viewed not as a private matter, but as a direct threat to the financial viability of the Route 66 brand. The producer pivoted from a position of demanding his star return to work to a position of aggressive, vindictive retaliation. The studio launched a coordinated media smear campaign to destroy his credibility. Screen Gems publicly accused Maharis of malingering, releasing statements to the press claiming he was deliberately faking the severity of his illness. The studio narrative asserted that Maharis was using a minor health issue as a convenient excuse to break his television contract in order to pursue more lucrative opportunities in feature films. This calculated attack was designed to turn the public against him and force him back onto the set through sheer reputational pressure. The hostility extended directly to the production environment. His co-star, Martin Milner, and the majority of the traveling crew alienated and isolated him. Maharis found himself entirely cut off from the professional family he had worked alongside for years, fighting a life-threatening illness while his employers actively attempted to destroy his public standing. In this hostile standoff, Maharis relied on his personal manager, Mimi Weber. Yet her aggressively uncompromising style transformed what should have been a protective shield into an impenetrable wall. By severing all direct communication with studio executives, she effectively locked both sides into a catastrophic gridlock, turning a medical crisis into an all-out industry war. Screen Gems retaliated by deploying the ultimate weapon of the studio system, the exclusivity lawsuit. The studio filed an injunction known legally as Lancer v. Maharis. The objective of this legal maneuver was total professional asphyxiation. The studio sought to enforce the exclusivity clauses of his contract, arguing that if he refused to work for them, he was legally barred from working for any other entity in the entertainment industry. They intended to freeze his career entirely, cutting off his ability to generate income while he was drowning in medical bills. The vindictiveness of Herbert B. Leonard reached a critical peak in June 1963. Maharis, attempting to slowly rebuild his career through less physically demanding avenues, had booked a highly anticipated singing performance on The Ed Sullivan Show. This variety program was the most powerful promotional platform in the United States, capable of launching careers overnight. Leonard and Screen Gems successfully petitioned the courts to issue a legal injunction that explicitly blocked Maharis from appearing on the broadcast. The studio demonstrated they were willing to use the full force of the American legal system to ensure he remained entirely invisible. Maharis refused to submit to this corporate intimidation. He took Screen Gems to court, initiating a brutal legal battle to reclaim his autonomy. The proceedings exposed the harsh realities of standard Hollywood contracts, highlighting how studios maintained absolute ownership over their talent. Maharis and his legal team argued that the studio had effectively breached the contract through their unreasonable demands and hostile actions during his severe illness. He ultimately emerged victorious. The court ruled in his favor, effectively voiding the draconian exclusivity clauses and granting him the legal freedom to seek employment elsewhere. Following the verdict, Maharis issued a definitive statement against the archaic mechanics of the industry. He stated clearly that the studio executives needed to learn one vital lesson, which was that the era of old Hollywood, where production companies could purchase movie stars like pieces of meat, had definitively ended. He had secured his legal freedom, but the cost of the victory was astronomical. In an industry built on executive relationships and compliance, defeating a major studio in court was considered an unforgivable offense. The power brokers of Hollywood rapidly closed ranks. He was universally labeled as arrogant, ungrateful, and impossible to control. He was quietly but efficiently placed on an unwritten blacklist, with major film studios refusing to cast him in leading roles. Meanwhile, the television empire that had tried to destroy him collapsed under its own weight. Route 66 attempted to continue production without its breakout star, replacing Maharis with another actor to ride alongside Martin Milner. The public firmly rejected the substitution. The dynamic chemistry that had anchored the series was gone, and the ratings plummeted immediately. The program was swiftly canceled, leaving a wreckage of damaged careers and demonstrating that while the studio owned the contract, they could not manufacture the authenticity that Maharis had brought to the screen. Emancipating himself from the draconian contracts of Screen Gems offered no protection against a far more pervasive adversary. The systematic destruction of his career in the ensuing decades was deeply embedded in the hostile sociological architecture of the era. The period spanning the 1950s through the 1970s represents the zenith of state-sponsored, institutionalized homophobia in the United States. Following the end of the Second World War and the onset of the Cold War, the American political establishment conflated homosexuality with moral decay and national security vulnerability. This era, widely known as the Lavender Scare, ran parallel to the anti-communist witch hunts of McCarthyism. The federal government purged thousands of gay men and women from civil service, viewing them as psychological deviants susceptible to blackmail. This political persecution was heavily reinforced by the medical and psychiatric establishments. The American Psychiatric Association's Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, known as the DSM, officially classified homosexuality as a severe sociopathic personality disturbance. Gay men were not merely considered social outcasts. They were scientifically categorized as mentally ill and legally classified as felons. In Los Angeles, this national paranoia was enforced at the street level with military precision by the Los Angeles Police Department. Under the rigid, highly conservative leadership of figures like Police Chief William H. Parker, the LAPD viewed the suppression of the homosexual community as a primary moral imperative. The Vice Squad was explicitly tasked with hunting gay men, utilizing a massive allocation of resources and manpower to execute a strategy of systematic entrapment. Because there were virtually no safe, legal spaces for gay men to congregate without the threat of police raids on underground bars and private residences, a clandestine subculture developed in public spaces. The Vice Squad weaponized this reality. Plainclothes police officers, chosen for their conventional attractiveness, were routinely deployed to public restrooms, public parks, and highway rest stops. Their explicit operational directive was to loiter in these spaces, initiate eye contact, signal mutual interest, and actively solicit sexual encounters. The moment a target responded to the bait, the trap snapped shut. Badges were flashed, handcuffs were deployed, and lives were irrevocably destroyed. This was the terrifying reality George Maharis navigated daily. He was an internationally recognized television star, a man whose face was plastered on magazine covers globally, existing in a city where undercover police officers were actively prowling the streets with the specific mandate to arrest men exactly like him. The cognitive dissonance was absolute. By day, he portrayed the rugged, hyper-masculine American hero. By night, he was a hunted citizen operating in the shadows of an unforgiving legal system. For years, Maharis managed to survive this high-stakes game of evasion. Following his departure from Route 66, he attempted to transition into the realm of major feature films. By the mid-1960s, he had secured critical roles in significant Hollywood productions. He starred in the tense 1965 biological thriller The Satan Bug, directed by the highly respected John Sturges, and the 1967 crime comedy The Happening, starring alongside Hollywood heavyweights like Anthony Quinn and Faye Dunaway. These projects were deliberate, strategic moves designed to solidify his status as a bankable, adult leading man in cinema. However, the fragile architecture of his double life sustained its first massive fracture on December 15, 1967. The incident occurred in the restroom of a prominent restaurant in Hollywood. The mechanics of the arrest followed the standard, ruthless blueprint of the LAPD Vice Squad. Maharis was intercepted by an undercover police officer operating a sting. He was arrested on the spot, detained, and thrust into the criminal justice system. The immediate aftermath was a masterclass in Hollywood crisis management, driven by pure financial panic. The studios backing his current and upcoming film projects recognized the catastrophic financial liability of a leading man facing morals charges. High-powered defense attorneys and studio fixers were immediately mobilized to suppress the fallout. Maharis was forced into a humiliating legal compromise. To avoid a highly publicized trial that would inevitably expose the exact details of the entrapment and the specific nature of the solicitation, he accepted a plea deal. The severe charges of lewd conduct were bargained down to a generalized, ambiguous misdemeanor, disturbing the peace. He paid a nominal fine of $50. In the eyes of the court, the matter was closed for a minor fee. In the brutal economy of Hollywood perception, however, a permanent mark had been made. The arrest briefly breached the mainstream press, generating aggressive whispers within the industry. It was the first public crack in the flawless heterosexual armor that Screen Gems had originally manufactured for him. The studios did not immediately banish him, largely because the plea deal provided a thin veneer of plausible deniability, but his status was permanently downgraded. He transitioned from a secure leading man to a calculated risk. As the 1960s bled into the 1970s, the cultural landscape of the United States underwent radical shifts. The sexual revolution, the women's liberation movement, and the birth of the modern gay rights movement, following the Stonewall riots of 1969, began to fracture the rigid conservatism of the post-war era. Yet, the executive suites of Hollywood remained stubbornly archaic, continuing to enforce unwritten moral codes upon their performers. Maharis found himself caught in this transitional purgatory. His career was steadily depreciating, confined mostly to episodic television guest spots and secondary film roles. The industry whispers regarding his 1967 arrest continued to act as a silent anchor, dragging down his earning potential and his professional standing. In 1973, at the age of 45, Maharis made a decision that shocked the entertainment industry. He agreed to pose entirely nude for the July issue of Playgirl magazine. This was far from a desperate publicity stunt. It was a calculated maneuver within the intense psychological warfare of his existence. Playgirl had launched that same year as a radical response to the male-dominated pornography industry, designed specifically to cater to female sexual agency. By placing himself as the centerfold, Maharis was engaging in a highly complex act of rebellion. For over a decade, his body had been a battleground. Screen Gems had exploited his physical form to sell Chevrolets and television advertising. The LAPD had policed his physical desires with the threat of incarceration. The industry executives had marginalized him based on whispers about his physical private life. By stripping off his clothes and presenting himself to the camera in a state of absolute, uncompromised physical confidence, Maharis reclaimed total ownership of his own physical form. At 45, he displayed a rigorously disciplined, heavily muscled physique that defied the aging process and the immense stress he had endured. It was a defiant, non-verbal assertion of his continued relevance and a direct challenge to the hypocritical executives who sought to diminish him. He laid himself bare, daring the public and the studios to look directly at the man they had spent years trying to control, sanitize, or destroy. The defiance of the Playgirl shoot could not dismantle the systemic policing of Los Angeles. The Vice Squad remained an active, predatory force, and the lack of safe infrastructure for the gay community continued to force individuals into highly precarious situations. His career faced a permanent setback on the evening of November 21, 1974. The setting was grimly mundane, the public restroom of a gas station located in Los Angeles. Maharis was arrested alongside a 33-year-old male hairdresser named Perfecto Tellez. The LAPD Vice Squad officers who executed the arrest did not hold back. They charged both men with sex perversion, a severe statutory classification that carried immense legal penalties and guaranteed catastrophic social ruin. Unlike the 1967 incident, there was no studio machinery mobilized to protect him. Maharis was acting without a powerful corporate shield. The legal mechanics played out similarly. His defense attorneys managed to negotiate the devastating felony charges down to a minor misdemeanor of trespassing, but the legal victory was entirely irrelevant. The true trial took place in the media, and the verdict was execution. The American tabloid press of the 1970s operated with absolute ruthlessness, unburdened by the ethical considerations of privacy regarding sexual orientation. When the news of the 1974 arrest broke, it was not reported as a minor trespassing infraction. It was broadcast as a major, scandalous revelation of moral deviancy. The media engaged in a systematic campaign of character assassination. They weaponized the details of the police report against the manufactured image of his past. Headlines explicitly juxtaposed the rugged, hyper-masculine Buzz Murdoch of Route 66 with the harsh, clinical reality of a Vice Squad arrest in a dirty gas station bathroom. To inflict maximum damage, the press routinely published the full name and profession of the other man involved, Perfecto Tellez. By explicitly linking the former television idol with a male hairdresser in a public restroom sting, the tabloids eradicated any remaining shred of plausible deniability. The narrative was cemented. George Maharis was a fraud who had deceived the American public. The reaction from the Hollywood establishment was swift, silent, and absolute. There were no public statements of condemnation from studio heads, nor were there formal letters of termination. The industry simply closed its doors. Casting directors stopped returning calls from his agents. Producers who had previously sought his gritty, realistic acting style suddenly found him entirely unsuitable for their projects. He became a toxic asset. The unwritten rules of the old studio system were rigidly enforced. A leading man could be an alcoholic, a domestic abuser, or a financial liability, and the industry would often look the other way. But a leading man exposed as a homosexual by the Vice Squad was deemed completely uninsurable and entirely unmarketable to the mainstream American audience. The era of George Maharis as the brooding, romantic leading man, the symbol of the American dream moving freely down the highway, was officially and permanently terminated. The machine that built him had finally succeeded in destroying his public identity. Stripped of his leading man status and exiled to the extreme margins of the industry, Maharis was forced to confront the wreckage of his career and find a mechanism for survival in a town that had decided he no longer existed. The aftermath of the 1974 arrest did not result in a dramatic, televised expulsion from the entertainment industry. Hollywood rarely operates with such transparency. Instead, George Maharis was subjected to a highly efficient, invisible mechanism of marginalization. The trajectory of his life from 1975 to 1993 reveals the precise, ruthless mechanics of how the Hollywood studio system dismantles a former leading man. Following the intense tabloid coverage of the Vice Squad sting, the phone lines to his talent agents went silent. In the film and television industry, leverage is dictated entirely by public perception and marketability. During the mid-1970s, the American cinematic landscape was undergoing a massive transition. The new Hollywood era, spearheaded by directors like Martin Scorsese and Francis Ford Coppola, championed gritty, uncompromising realism. Paradoxically, while the screenplays became darker and more complex, the executive tolerance for real-world controversy regarding sexual orientation remained firmly anchored in the conservatism of the 1950s. Maharis was caught in a brutal contradiction. He possessed the raw, authentic method acting training that defined this new era of cinema, but he carried a personal stigma that studio executives deemed financially unviable. When a major studio greenlights a multi-million-dollar feature film, the leading actors are subjected to rigorous risk assessment by insurance bonding companies and marketing departments. Maharis, now permanently linked in the press to a public restroom arrest, was classified as a toxic asset. The major production houses, Warner Brothers, Paramount, 20th Century Fox, quietly removed his name from their casting shortlists. There was no formal blacklist manifesto, only a collective unspoken consensus among casting directors and producers that hiring Maharis would invite unwanted media scrutiny and potentially alienate the core American demographic. He was effectively blocked from the prestigious, high-paying A-list projects that had once been his natural domain. Stripped of his leading man status, Maharis faced a stark financial reality. He was a working actor who needed to generate income to survive in Los Angeles. If the major studios refused to hire him to carry a film, he was forced to step down the hierarchical ladder of the entertainment industry, transitioning into the grueling, unglamorous world of commercial television guest appearances and low-budget independent cinema. During the late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, the American television landscape was dominated by episodic anthology series and procedural detective dramas. Shows like Fantasy Island, Kojak, The Bionic Woman, Police Story, and later Murder, She Wrote operated as massive industrial assembly lines. They required a constant influx of recognizable, highly competent actors to serve as weekly guest stars, usually playing the victim, the red herring, or the villain of the week. For former leading men, this circuit functioned as a lucrative but creatively hollow holding pen. The mechanics of this work were highly transactional. A guest star would be hired for a 5 to 7 day shooting schedule. They would arrive on set, memorize heavily formatted, exposition-heavy dialogue, hit their tape marks, and leave. There was no time for the deep psychological excavation or character development that Maharis had studied under Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio. The cognitive dissonance for Maharis during this period must have been profound. A little over a decade earlier, he had owned the screen on Route 66. He had been the anchor of the production, the primary reason millions of viewers tuned in every week. Now he was a transient worker in other people's television vehicles. He approached this era with the grim pragmatism of a survivor. He accepted dozens of these guest-starring roles. He played businessmen, corrupt officials, and various antagonists. He brought his inherent intensity to the roles, remaining a highly capable and professional presence on camera, but the material was fundamentally disposable. The scripts did not require his formidable talent. They merely required his recognizable face to lend a brief sense of gravitas to commercial television filler. He was participating in the very machine that had previously commodified his youth, but he was now operating on the absolute margins of its power structure. Parallel to his television work, Maharis attempted to maintain a presence in feature films. However, because the major studio doors remained locked, he was forced to navigate the secondary market of independent, low-budget filmmaking. This tier of the industry often operates on a completely different business model than mainstream Hollywood. These films are usually financed through independent investors or international pre-sales, shot on severely compressed schedules, and rely heavily on sensationalism, violence, or exploitation to turn a profit. The descent into this tier of filmmaking is a common trajectory for actors who have fallen out of favor with the major studios, but it is creatively punishing. Maharis found himself cast in projects that were entirely disconnected from the artistic ambitions of his theatrical roots. A prime example of this era was his participation in the 1982 release The Sword and the Sorcerer, a low-budget fantasy adventure film designed to capitalize on the success of Conan the Barbarian. Maharis played a supporting antagonist role. The production was chaotic, the script was derivative, and the primary focus was on special effects and action choreography rather than character psychology. He was a highly trained, award-winning method actor forced to recite clunky expositional dialogue while wearing cheap costumes on rushed, poorly lit sets. The industry had essentially trapped him in a cycle of artistic degradation. Every low-budget film he accepted to pay the bills further diluted his brand, making it increasingly difficult to ever return to the prestige projects he was actually capable of executing. He was working continuously, yet he was professionally invisible to the critical establishment. To sustain a career in this environment requires a specific type of psychological endurance. For nearly 20 years, Maharis endured the daily indignities of being a marginalized former star. He had to walk onto sets populated by younger executives and directors who viewed him not as the groundbreaking talent of the early 1960s, but as a cautionary tale of the 1970s. He maintained his professionalism. Unlike many of his contemporaries who turned to heavy substance abuse or public meltdowns when faced with the loss of their stardom, Maharis possessed the hardened discipline of his working-class Marine Corps background. He treated acting as manual labor. He showed up on time, delivered the performance requested by the director, collected his paycheck, and retreated into his private life. However, the cumulative weight of this transactional existence eventually extracts a toll. The passion that had driven him to fiercely pursue his art and the fierce rebellion that had won him a Theater World Award found no outlet in the sterile environment of 1980s television procedurals or direct-to-video action films. The Hollywood machine was no longer exploiting him as a sex symbol. It was simply utilizing him as a functional, interchangeable spare part. The breaking point, or rather, the point of final exhaustion, arrived in the early 1990s. Maharis was now in his mid-60s. He had spent 3 decades navigating the treacherous, often hostile terrain of the Los Angeles entertainment industry. In 1993, he accepted a supporting role in the film Doppelganger, a supernatural thriller starring a young Drew Barrymore. The film was a chaotic, critically panned production that was largely relegated to the direct-to-video market and late-night cable broadcasts. Maharis played a secondary character, delivering a functional performance in a film that required very little of his actual capability. When production wrapped on Doppelganger, Maharis assessed the landscape of his career. The industry was not going to offer him redemption. There would be no late-career renaissance, no prestigious supporting roles in major studio dramas, and no apologies from the executive suites that had weaponized his sexuality against him. The Hollywood apparatus had nothing left to offer him except a continuation of the same creatively hollow, low-tier roles he had been executing for 2 decades. He faced a definitive choice. He could continue to accept diminishing roles, holding on to the frayed edges of his acting identity until he physically could not work anymore, or he could take control of the narrative and walk away. Maharis chose autonomy. Following the release of Doppelganger, he made the deliberate, unannounced decision to completely withdraw from the entertainment industry. He fired no parting shots in the press, granted no dramatic exit interviews, and sought no industry fanfare. He simply stopped participating. This withdrawal was not an act of surrender. It was an act of extreme self-preservation. By stepping away from the cameras permanently, Maharis actively revoked Hollywood's access to him. He stripped off the heavy artificial armor he had been forced to wear since he first signed with Screen Gems. He was no longer Buzz Murdoch. He was no longer a disgraced tabloid headline, and he was no longer a television guest star for hire. In 1993, George Maharis officially closed the ledger on his acting career, turning his back on the machine that had built and broken him, and stepped quietly into the private life he had fought so fiercely to protect. After decades in the Hollywood machine, he found absolute sovereignty in the blurred lines of impressionist painting. On his canvas, there were no studio executives, no exploitative contracts, and no draconian morality clauses, only the quiet, uncompromised freedom of a man finally speaking with his own voice. He divided his post-Hollywood decades between residences in New York and Beverly Hills. In these private sanctuaries, he engaged fully in his second, and arguably most authentic artistic discipline, painting. Maharis did not paint as a casual hobby to pass the time in retirement. He approached it with the same intense, disciplined focus he had once applied to the Meisner technique at the neighborhood playhouse. Working primarily within the impressionist style, he traded the heavy artificial makeup of the studio for the smell of linseed oil, turpentine, and oil paint. His gravitation toward Impressionism was deeply tied to the style's core philosophy. Impressionism is not concerned with rigid, photographic accuracy. It focuses on the capture of light, the fluidity of movement, and the subjective, emotional resonance of a fleeting moment. For a man whose entire public life had been defined by the harsh, high-contrast spotlight of tabloid journalism and police flashbulbs, this artistic medium offered absolute freedom. Impressionism allowed for blurred lines and complex interpretations, entirely rejecting the rigid, black and white moral binaries that the 1960s studio system had used to condemn him. More importantly, the canvas offered a transactional honesty that Hollywood never could. A painting does not demand a morals clause. A canvas does not care about the sexual orientation of the hand holding the brush. In the solitary environment of his studio, Maharis was finally able to dismantle the suffocating, heavy mask of the hypermasculine, heterosexual wanderer that Herbert B. Leonard and Screen Gems had bolted onto him in 1960. Every brushstroke was an exercise in untangling his true identity from the Buzz Murdoch persona. The anger of the exclusivity lawsuits, the sheer terror of the Vice Squad arrests, the humiliation of the tabloid exposure, and the creative degradation of the B-movie circuit, all of this accumulated psychological debris was processed and released through his art. He was no longer reciting someone else's dialogue. He was speaking with his own voice, a voice that had been silenced since his youth in Queens. Surviving the relentless police stings of the Lavender Scare was a profound victory of endurance. Yet, as the 1980s dawned, a far deadlier shadow fell over his community. From the quiet margins of his Hollywood exile, Maharis watched helplessly as the generation of men who had navigated that same clandestine world alongside him was systematically eradicated by the HIV epidemic. This is a crucial, often overlooked layer of his biographical timeline. Maharis, a gay man living in the epicenters of the crisis, was in his 50s and 60s as the plague tore through his demographic. The generation of men who had shared the clandestine, underground world of Los Angeles with him, the actors, the set designers, the writers, and the men who had been forced to hide from the vice squads in the 1960s and 1970s, were dying in staggering numbers. The political and medical establishments of the era responded to the early years of the AIDS crisis with the same lethal indifference and active hostility that had characterized the Lavender Scare. The government ignored the mounting death toll because the victims were deemed socially expendable. For Maharis, the psychological weight of witnessing this devastation must have been profound. He had already survived the systemic state-sponsored homophobia of the LAPD, enduring arrests that were designed to destroy his life. Now he was watching a biological plague finish the work of eradicating his community. He existed in a state of complex survivor's guilt, a common psychological burden for gay men of his generation who lived through the height of the epidemic. There is a grim, unintended irony in his Hollywood exile. The industry embargo that pushed him to the margins of public life, forcing him into a quieter, more isolated existence, may have inadvertently insulated him from the epicenters of the crisis. He navigated the darkest years of the epidemic with the quiet, hardened resilience of a Marine Corps veteran. He attended the funerals, mourned the eradication of a generation of talent, and continued to paint, carrying the memories of those who did not survive the transition into the new millennium. As the decades progressed, Maharis underwent the natural biological process of aging, a process that is highly weaponized in the entertainment industry. Hollywood demands eternal youth, punishing physical deterioration by rendering older actors invisible. For Maharis, however, aging out of the Hollywood demographic was not a punishment. It was the final stage of his emancipation. His physical body had been the primary source of his trauma. It was his body that was pushed to the point of a biological collapse in the freezing waters off Catalina Island. It was his body that the studios marketed as a sexual commodity. It was his physical desires that the LAPD criminalized, and his naked form that he weaponized in the pages of Playgirl. In his 70s and 80s, living quietly in Beverly Hills, he finally achieved absolute physical autonomy. He was no longer required to maintain the rugged physique of a television idol. He was no longer a target for undercover police officers looking to fill an arrest quota. He lived openly, unapologetically, and privately. He did not seek the validation of the press, nor did he attempt to author a sensationalized memoir to cash in on his past trauma. The society outside the walls of his studio was rapidly changing. The rigid, unforgiving world of 1964, where a television studio could destroy a man's life for being gay, was slowly being dismantled. Maharis lived long enough to witness the decriminalization of homosexuality, the establishment of legal protections, and the eventual legalization of same-sex marriage. He watched the institutions that had hunted him be forced to apologize to the community they had decimated. Yet, Maharis did not re-emerge to claim the mantle of a civil rights pioneer. He did not seek the spotlight of the modern LGBTQ+ movement. He understood that his specific war had been fought in the courtrooms against screen gems and in the interrogation rooms of the Los Angeles Police Department decades earlier. He had paid the price for his existence on the front lines of a much colder, lonelier war. His victory was not loud. It was the quiet, undeniable fact of his continued existence. He had outlasted the executives who fired him, the police chiefs who targeted him, and the tabloid editors who mocked him. The progression of time eventually neutralizes the most volatile of conflicts. For George Maharis, entering his 90s in the quiet enclave of Beverly Hills represented the ultimate victory of endurance. His daily reality was no longer defined by the exhausting, hyper-vigilant preservation of a manufactured secret. It was defined by the simple, undeniable fact that he was still breathing, still painting, and entirely in control of his own narrative. The conclusion of his life arrived with a profound, almost clinical irony. On May 24, 2023, George Maharis passed away peacefully in his home at the age of 94. The underlying cause of his death was reported as complications from hepatitis, echoing the very viral infection he had contracted in 1962 on the grueling set of Route 66 and the freezing waters off Catalina Island. Half a century after Herbert B. Leonard and Screen Gems had accused him of faking an illness to break a contract, that very illness cast a shadow until his final day, serving as a permanent biological record of the brutality of the studio system. When news of his passing reached the public sphere, the media obituaries presented a stark contrast to the vicious tabloid headlines of 1974. The cultural landscape had shifted entirely. Major publications recounted his life with a newfound lens of historical objectivity. They detailed the immense popularity of Route 66, his undeniable talent as a method actor, and the harsh realities of the Lavender Scare that had derailed his trajectory. The press finally acknowledged what Maharis had known for decades. His downfall was not a moral failure, but a structural persecution. The industry that had once blacklisted him for being a homosexual now had to contextualize his life within the broader, necessary evolution of civil rights. The enduring significance of George Maharis extends far beyond the archival footage of a Chevrolet Corvette navigating the American highway. His life serves as a critical, unvarnished case study of the American entertainment complex during the mid-20th century. Route 66 sold the American public on the idea of unlimited mobility and absolute freedom. The characters could drive anywhere, be anyone, and overcome any obstacle. Yet the man portraying this ultimate freedom was entirely trapped. The open road was a television set, and the liberty was a heavily monitored script. The moment he attempted to exercise actual autonomy in his private life, the industry immediately barricaded his path. His story exposes the deep hypocrisy of a corporate machine that demanded absolute authenticity on camera while ruthlessly punishing it in private life. Beyond the confines of the entertainment industry, his biography maps the brutal trajectory of LGBTQ's history in the United States. He lived through an era where state-sponsored entrapment was a standard policing tactic, where basic human desires were pathologized by medicine and criminalized by law. He was a man who lost his career not because he lacked talent, but because he existed in a society that demanded his erasure. Yet his response was not one of tragic martyrdom. By fighting the studio in court, by posing for Playgirl to reclaim his physical autonomy, and by simply refusing to disappear into a spiral of self-destruction, he modeled a specific, hardened form of resistance. He demonstrated that survival itself is a radical act when the system is designed to break you. His legacy is not a tragedy, but a quiet, uncompromising victory of endurance. He was a kid from Astoria who fought his way to the pinnacle of American culture, surviving the blinding glare of the American dream and its most punishing hypocrisies. Stripped of his fame and banished from his profession, he did not shatter. He redirected his intense energy, found salvation in the silent strokes of a paintbrush, and built a sustainable, authentic life in the aftermath of his own cultural execution. He proved that dignity is not a commodity granted by television studios or stripped away by tabloid magazines. It is forged internally. George Maharis navigated the heights of the American dream and survived its hypocrisies, ultimately claiming the freedom to simply live as himself.